we look at the past 50 years or maybe even 100 years, that's true. Agricultural production, yield per acre, or liters of milk per cow have gone up. In 1908, Fritz Haber, a German scientist, invented a process to manufacture nitrogen fertilizer in the lab. And a few years later, his buddy Carl Bosch scaled it up so they could make it an industrial process. We had never had synthetic nitrogen fertilizer before then. And after they did that, we had nitrogen fertilizer. And the use of nitrogen fertilizer has gone up and up and up. And even after the Green Revolution, which happened in the 1960s, mostly because of the availability of nitrogen fertilizer, and that meant we could get more crop yield, more bushels of corn or more bushels of soy or more bushels of wheat per acre because we were putting nitrogen fertilizer on. Even since the 1960s and the Green Revolution, the use of nitrogen fertilizer has gone up 8 times, and yields have only doubled in that time. But we've, in our society, we've had a cheap food policy, and we've had so much confidence that we can just keep increasing yields the way we have in the past, that we've accepted it as the way things are going to be in the next 100 years. And that's where I think he has made a very incorrect assumption. I'm quite sure that yields in the future will be much more variable. They may be high one year and low the next. Just ask the farmers in BC from this year. And after this article was published, I had an email from a farmer in BC who said to me that I was far too soft in the way I put things. And I talked about how yields in agriculture might decrease by 1/3 within the next 60 years. She said, in my farm in BC, it's been happening for the last 3 or 4 years, and it was really bad this year. In Ontario, crop yields have actually been pretty good, and especially in 2021, crop yields were very high. It wasn't so long ago that it was really quite remarkable to get 100 bushels of corn per acre, and then they kept going up. And a few years ago, getting 200 bushels of corn per acre was considered to be a high mark. In 2021, that was the average in Ontario. And it's mostly because we've got more heat earlier in the season and later in the season. And we really haven't had too much water or too little water, or temperatures that are too high or too low at the wrong times to bring those yields down. But some years we will. And as we go into the future, there'll be a lot more variability. And with the variability, sometimes that means that the yields will be much lower, regardless of how much nitrogen fertilizer is applied. The other thing I want to say about that is nitrogen fertilizer is going to be getting more and more expensive. The price of natural gas has gone up a lot within the last year, and nitrogen fertilizer is directly linked to natural gas because we need the natural gas, that's CH4, we need that as a source of hydrogen to manufacture nitrogen fertilizer, and we need the energy to have high temperatures and high pressure in order to go through the manufacturing process. So that is costly from an economic point of view, it's costly from a fossil fuel point of view, and it's costly from the point of view of GHG emissions, greenhouse gas emissions, and methane is worse, of course, than CO2. You can't just assume that there's the same type of soil in Northern Ontario and Northern Canada that there is in Southern Canada. Like glaciation created some ideal soil conditions in the part of Ontario now where we have our best farmland. In the north, the soil tends to be shallow, and often the pH is quite low, and sometimes it's waterlogged, or there are wetlands, which has its own ecological benefits. But even if the average temperature goes a little bit higher, the thing about climate change is the variability. With the average temperature going up, that means that sometimes temperatures will be too high, or they'll be too low, or precipitation will be too high or too low and at the wrong times. And so to think about shifting out of Southern Ontario and just moving a little bit north makes all kinds of assumptions about the soil up there being as good as it is here. And according to the IPCC, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, the worst case scenarios seem to be in Asia, parts of Africa, actually in a belt north and south of the equator. That's where the most serious impacts for reducing agricultural yields are expected to happen. But we don't know what will happen with variability. And, you know, sometimes we get polar air moving down when we didn't expect it, and that can block the flow of the westerlies. That can affect precipitation and moisture. As far as I can tell, relatively speaking, and on average, we are fortunate to be living in Ontario. But as we go into the future, I think, and I said in the article, I described Canadian farmland, particularly Ontario farmland, will be like a global oasis. And I think that gives us even more responsibility to make sure that we look after that farmland and make sure that we can use it in the future as we're going to need to. I think there'll be lots of demand for Canadian agricultural products in the future. I remember being at meetings 10 or 15 years ago, and there were some food company executives from Canadian food companies who were arguing that the Canadian government should do more to help Canadian agriculture be more competitive on the world scene. And at that meeting, I made the argument that as we have more climate change and as we go into the future, and if we have relative stability in Ontario, we're going to have all the customers we want. And our job is to make sure that we look after the land base and look after our agricultural infrastructure to the best extent possible. And I know we have to make a living today as well, but in the future, I think we will. And I would just say that Ontario may be one of the pockets of relative agricultural stability. I don't think we'll be the only region, but I think we may be one of the pockets. And yes, I think that there will be a lot of people looking to buy our agricultural products.
So maybe as a final question then, what's your message to us about how we need to care for and protect our prime farmland in Ontario right now?
Well, it's invaluable. It's going to become more and more important. It's very important now, and it's just going to become more important in the future. And once you put concrete on it and seal it with concrete, it will take a long time to bring it back, longer than what we have to restore it. Much better to have farmland that's in good shape now and to keep it that way. My colleague, Woody Van Arkel, he's a farmer that I've worked with and I really respect. And when he's talking about degrading soil and soil organic matter, he said, it's a lot easier to let it go downhill than it is to build it up again. And sealing agricultural land with concrete is just about the worst degradation possible. In those cases, we remove all the topsoil, we put concrete on it. That's not what we want to do. So we're going to have to figure out how to be realistic about how we want to live in the future. And if that means more densification, so be it. Agricultural farmland, the prime ag land, is it's sacred. Like, it's something that we have been left as a legacy, and our descendants are going to wonder why we let so much of it be paved over. And if we do even more so now, they're going to hold us responsible for that.
Thanks so much, Professor Martin. I think we have learned a lot in this little interview, and I really appreciate the time that you've spent answering my questions.
You're welcome. I really enjoyed this too. It's as you can tell, you just have to press the start button, and I love to talk about this.